thanks to all of you at the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council. It's great to be with all of you. And I was saying to Joe earlier, this is probably the prettiest setting that I've been to for any Affairs Council talk. I've been trained as a historian. So when I do talks, I always, even though I'm going to talk mostly about contemporary issues, I always start looking back at the past. And as I talk about the US, India, China triangle today, I'll start by kind of taking you back 25 years to give you a little bit of context and to see kind of where we're coming from when we think about this triangle. 25 years ago, there were US sanctions on India. Today, the US calls India its most consequential partner. India calls the US its most indispensable partner. What caused this shift? It's just 25 years. It's not that old a relationship, so to speak. What caused that shift from friction to friendship? One that has taken place over multiple administrations of very different political stripes in both countries. The argument I'll make today here, and the bottom line up front that I'll give you, is that a crucial part of the answer is what drove that shift is China. It hasn't been the only factor driving the US-India partnership, but the two countries' shared concerns about a rising China's assertive behavior has been a crucial, even essential factor in the deepening and the broadening of this relationship. So if you do go back 25 years, you see a relationship with, even then, China was a factor, but in a very different way. And it was in a different way in the sense that you had, why were there US sanctions on India? Because India had conducted its nuclear tests in 1998. And the China angle was there then in the Indian Prime Minister's letter to President Clinton at the time, talking about why India tested its nuclear weapons. And he said that India's reason for doing so, that it was needed for deterrence against its large nuclear neighbor, China, which had tested it back in the 1960s. But at that time, this triangle between the US and India and China looked very different. At that time, it wasn't the US and India trying to balance or deter China. It was when India tested these nuclear weapons, the US and China jointly issued a statement condemning these tests. And so you saw that at the time, and that annoyed India considerably. Today, as I said, China's a glue in the US-India relationship. At that time, China was a cause of friction between the US and India. Now, I've just talked about the last 25 years, but just to give you a sense, this idea of a China factor in the US-India relationship isn't new. It has existed for years. The book I wrote focuses on the history. I'm just going to give you a very brief kind of 2-minute guide. There were going to be kind of nice little flags that would make it simple. So what you saw in the kind of 1950s, particularly the early 1950s, you saw China and India actually ranged against the US. China obviously being, a Soviet ally and was thought of as part of the communist monolith, and so not on the outs with the US. India didn't have major differences with the US as such, but did believe this idea of a China-India partnership. That a kind of Asia for Asians mentality, newly independent or established countries working together in Asia, and keeping big powers out because they brought instability according to these two countries. And so there was a brief period of cooperation between China and India, which used to upset people in DC about Delhi's approach, saying, you're actually partnering with our adversary. You then actually move into the late 1950s and the 60s, where you see a little bit of the situation as it is today, which is India's relationship with China had deteriorated, and you saw the US coming to India's assistance in the 1962 war it fought with China. And so China at that time was a glue in the relationship. But after the Sino-US rapprochement in 1971, India moved from seeing the US as the balancing partner to help it deter China to seeing the Soviet Union as that partner. So in the 1970s and 80s, you actually saw the US and China now on one side of the triangle with India on the other partnered with the Soviet Union. In the 80s, this becomes more complex because after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, you see not just as India saw it, US and China working together, but India's other adversary, Pakistan, because the US was, of course, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan with Pakistan support. And interestingly, Steve Cole had a great book about this, which covered it with Chinese support as well. In the 1990s, things start to change where this looks very different in the sense that everybody was engaging with everybody. India was trying to kind of reestablish ties with both China and the US, and you saw kind of a more complex situation. But now we've seen this kind of 25-year period, as I said, where you've seen this slow shift to going back to what we saw in the late 50s and most of the 60s, which is this US-India kind of partnership that is driven in part by China. Now, if we come to the US, to this current phase, how does this look from the US perspective? Why is kind of India figuring? If you go back to the Indo-Pacific strategy that the Biden administration released in February 2022, didn't get much attention because it was released the same week as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but this encapsulated how the US was thinking about the Asia or the Indo-Pacific theater. And the idea essentially was, the way that the Biden administration put it, is that it was important for the US to shape a favorable balance of power and influence in the Indo-Pacific to achieve the objective of a secure, prosperous, resilient region where countries were free to make choices and free from coercion. But the strategy also said that the US was neither willing nor able to achieve this objective alone. And so, echoing something actually that the Biden administration had talked about just in a very different, the Trump administration had talked about burden sharing. The Biden administration also, in a very different approach, of course, but says what the US needs is allies and partners that will help ensure this favorable balance of power and influence in the region. Now, as we know, there's not much the Trump and Biden administrations agree on. But on this, in terms of the Indo-Pacific, not just that this is the kind of vision the US wants to see, they agreed. They also agreed that this vision, this objective of the region was being challenged, and that it was being challenged by China's assertive behavior. And so you see this administration in some ways echoing the previous one, saying China is the pacing threat. And so as the US is looking around and saying, who are the partners who are like-minded? Who sees, even if they're not same-minded, that is, they don't see China exactly the same way, where is their convergence on this objective for the region, this vision for the region? Where is their kind of shared views on this being challenged by China? And where is their shared desire to do something about it? Now, there are some allies that meet these three criteria, Australia, Japan, but interestingly, a country that's not an ally, India, ends up being, for both the Trump and now the Biden administration, a country that actually meets these three criteria, in some cases actually more so than some US allies in Asia, including, like, for example, Thailand. And at one point, at that time, even Philippines, things have obviously changed. And so you see over the last kind of 10 years or so, this developing, and particularly this last 10 years, this strategic convergence that the US sees with India on these shared concerns about China. And what this has done is it has driven cooperation, closer cooperation than ever before between the US and India from Washington's perspective. We're soon going to see another visit by National Security Advisor Sullivan to India. And last year, about a year ago, Prime Minister Modi, of course, was in Washington, and President Biden went to India. So you're seeing a lot of this kind of diplomatic, but also broad range of cooperation, which I'll talk about. But you've also seen that because of the strategic convergence on the Indo-Pacific and China, you've also seen the Biden administration and the Trump administration before it incentivized to manage differences more effectively with India. Whether that is on economic issues, in the Trump administration, particularly trade issues, whether that is on the subject of Russia, or whether that is on the subject of India, a country that doesn't really do alliances, so to speak. So what about India? Where does India stand when it comes to the US and China? A few years ago in 2019, there was an exchange about this between a former Indian official and a former American official. And the American official was General Petraeus. The Indian official was somebody called S. Jaishankar, who was former then, ends up then a few months later becoming India's foreign minister, which he is to this day. And David Petraeus said China was, quote, the defining issue of our age, and seemingly in frustration, added that countries like India have to decide. And he asked if India indeed would take a stand and would choose a side. And Jaishankar retorted, he said, India should take a stand and it should take a side, our side. Now, many in India and the US interpreted this remark as suggesting that India's approach would be to be, as it was in the past, non-aligned. That India would walk a middle path between China and the US and avoid taking sides in the geopolitical competition unfurling between China and the United States. And this idea that India would be non-aligned, walk this middle path, was very much shaped by views of India's stance during the US-Soviet Cold War. And I presume when you look at India that way, led people to believe that when it comes to US-China competition, India would take a similar stance, a hedge between the US and China, play one off against the other, walk a middle path. But in reality, that is not what we're seeing. We are not seeing India weigh the two countries or hedge or walk a middle path. India will not be a US military ally at any point. We can talk about why India doesn't do alliances in the Q&A. But while it won't be an ally, it also is not non-aligned when it comes to China. It will and has aligned with the US and others on key interests to balance China, because today, as India sees the world, its options aren't the same as they were during the Cold War. As Delhi looks at US-China competition today, there are some key differences compared to the US-Soviet Cold War when India is looking at the world. For one, the geography of competition. The primary theater of competition during the old Cold War was Europe. Today, India can't stay aloof. It can't sit on the fence because this Cold War, so to speak, this new Cold War, this US-China competition, is taking place in Asia. And it's one of the two superpower competitors is India's neighbor. So this is literally taking place on India's doorstep. It can't stay aloof. Today, the other reason India can't really stay aloof is that its own power and position in the world today are different. Unlike during the Cold War, today India is not kind of a country just trying to nation build, form a new country, trying to take not just a developing country, but really with hundreds of millions of poor people. Today, India is a state that has one of the largest militaries in the world. It has nuclear weapons. It has a thriving space program, an economy that is larger than 3 of the permanent 5 in the Security Council. And today, that economy has also made it an aid donor compared to it being an aid recipient during the Cold War. And it is also a member of key regional and global institutions and coalitions as well. It is being actively sought out by a partner by many countries. And this position gives India more space. Yes, it's got a lot of potential, not just the US, other partners in Europe, in Asia seeking it out. It does give India more space, but it also makes India staying aloof very difficult for India from staying away from key discussions and debates. But the biggest difference in terms of how India saw and why it could stay non-aligned during the Cold War, the biggest difference in how it looks at the situation today is that makes fence-sitting not an option for India, is that its relationships with the US and China are very different from its relationships with the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. During that period, India maintained ties with both Washington and Moscow. India had differences with the Soviet Union and the US at that time, but there were no fundamental disputes or conflicts of interest that it had with either country. Today, the nature and extent of India's relationships with the US and China are very different. Whether you look at diplomatic engagement, defense and security ties, economic ties, trade and investment, people to people. So where Indian students are going, where is India buying its weapons from, where is it buying its oil, gas, and even coal from? You see the US, where are its tourists going, where are tourists coming from? If you look at every one of these domains, the US is, if not the top country, in the top 2 or 3 for India. China only features in one space, which is it's India's second largest trade partner, and I'll come to that. But otherwise, China doesn't really figure in terms of the extent of the relationship. But even more of a difference even within the space of these different relationships is that as India looks at the US and China, it sees in one corner it has China, which alone in conjunction with Pakistan is India's most significant external challenge. It now even uses the word rival, if not adversary. So it does actually have fundamental disputes and conflicts of interest with China. In the other corner of this new Cold War, India sees one of its closest partners. As I said, Prime Minister Modi called it India's indispensable partner. And it has become a close partner in part because India sees the US as part of the solution. The US as part of the solution to its China problem. The US and India have differences, and I'll come to them, but there are no fundamental disputes. That's not the case with the India-China relationship. India has seen China as a geopolitical challenge since the late 1950s. As I said, alone, but also as a kind of tag team with Pakistan. While the degree of that threat perception in New Delhi of China has varied and there have been different approaches taken, this has remained a consistent element for Indian foreign policy, security policymakers since the late 1950s. At the heart of India's concerns about and the competition that it has with China lies their boundary dispute. Now, these two countries have the longest undemarcated border in the world. They have competing claims to a state that India claims, and the US recognizes in India, that India holds, and China claims in their kind of eastern sector of their border. But then there's a bit of territory that connects Tibet and Xinjiang that China holds and India claims. This border dispute is what resulted in the two countries fighting a war in 1962. It's also led to a number of additional skirmishes and standoffs in the meantime. What the two countries did do, in part because they recognized at some point that both wanted to focus on development and growth, and they did not want to actually be involved in security conflicts with each other, that they wanted to hide and bide, as Deng Xiaoping used to put it. Both sides agreed in 1988 to start, and what ended up being a 15-year-long process. And over these 15 years, the two countries signed a range of agreements, actually more extensive than anything the US and China have had. These agreements set up a whole structure to manage their boundary dispute. And it paved the way for China-India cooperation, including for China to become India's largest trading partner at one point. So you saw these agreements, and they had very elaborate protocols of at the boundary that if there were going to be no unilateral changes to the status quo. The troops that were up there in this kind of area that's both man's land, essentially, that both sides claim, the troops were not supposed to carry loaded weapons. So the idea would be that even if there was a problem, there were then these mechanisms, military to military, diplomatic to diplomatic, and then political to political, structures that still exist, that these were going to be able to manage any conflict. It wouldn't escalate. And by this time, of course, both countries are now nuclear powers. So you don't want that kind of escalation. So this goes on in terms of you start to see this India-China relationship that seems to be settling in. India also sees China as somewhat like-minded in certain multilateral domains on trade, on climate change, as a fellow developing countries. So you saw this relationship get that aspect of cooperation. But since about 2008, 2009, so really around the global financial crisis, India, like other countries in Asia, starts to see or detect a more assertive China, both when it came to bilateral relations, but also in the region more broadly. This starts to get worse from India's perspective, that China is no longer biding its time and hiding its capability and intentions once Xi Jinping comes to power. So between 1988 and 2013, while these various agreements were being negotiated between China and India, there was a lull at the border. There were no major skirmishes. There were no kind of Indian troops going and trying to lay claim somewhere, changing facts on the ground. There were no PLA troops. But then Xi Jinping comes to power, and suddenly you see incident after incident at the border where you see the PLA come and try to change facts on the ground. Essentially cross into areas that both sides claim set up an encampment. You're not supposed to do this according to these agreements. You see this happening in 2013. You see this happening in 2014, even as Xi Jinping is visiting the then newly elected Indian Prime Minister Modi, who had said, I want to do business with the Chinese, I want to resolve our border dispute. Well, Xi Jinping comes, but turns out so do some PLA soldiers trying to capture some territory in the north. So you see a border crisis in 2013, 2014, again in 2015, and then in 2017 at the China-India-Bhutan tri-junction. But nonetheless, India continued to engage with China, and it took what was essentially a competitive engagement approach. Just like here in the US, there were areas of cooperation, areas of competition. But today you've seen an India that's moved from that competitive engagement approach to essentially an approach of armed coexistence. And that was the result of another boundary crisis. Now, the previous ones I mentioned took place at essentially one point, where you saw the PLA move in at one point. There was a boundary crisis in 2020 that is still ongoing, that has been the most serious between the two countries for about 4.5 decades. Delhi accused the PLA of trying to unilaterally change the status quo at multiple locations. It ended up being the first fatal clash between the two countries in 45 years, the first shots fired at the boundary in decades, and larger deployments from both militaries. They've resolved some of the points of dispute, but in major areas today, you still see India and China facing off, and that has brought the China-India relationship to the lowest point the two countries have had since the two countries fought that war in 1962. What that boundary crisis did in New Delhi and along with China's handling of COVID, so it was like a 1-2 punch. First, there's a concern in India about the lack of transparency, the way China handled COVID. But then this border crisis happens, even as everybody's trying to grapple with COVID. You see Indian views of China really hardening after that. The Indian government saw Beijing as having violated the boundary agreements on which the whole relationship was based, not just the boundary, and saying that there was zero trust in China that the PLA wouldn't do this again. And what that meant has been that India now continues to deploy troops at the border. It has redeployed troops from its Pakistan border to its China border. It has increased its military capabilities. Another impact of this crisis, this boundary crisis, is that it weakened the hands of those. There was no debate on China in India anymore, really. It weakened the hands of those in the Indian government who had been arguing that greater economic engagement with China would alleviate political strains, that interdependence would bring peace. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And it has accelerated Indian concerns, not just about the border, but suddenly you had an India that was actually increasing economic, societal, and other engagement with China. It now becomes concerned about economic and societal exposure to China. India goes from seeing economic ties with China as an opportunity to seeing them as a vulnerability. And so what you see is also not just changes in terms of the debate in India or at the border. You see in terms of domestic policy changes, India impose a series of restrictions or imposing extra scrutiny on a range of Chinese activities in India, in a number of domains, including economic restrictions on investment from China, technology, banned a number of apps overnight, including TikTok, telecommunications, no Huawei in Indian 5G networks, but also restrictions in terms of public diplomacy, education, media. There are now no Chinese journalists in India. There are no Indian journalists in China. But there's also, beyond the debate in domestic policy, there's a real impact on foreign policy in India, which is you start seeing India doubling down on its balancing relationships, which I'll come to. But I just want to, because I often get this question, what happens if India and China reach a grand bargain on the border tomorrow? What if Xi Jinping comes to his senses and says, why did I upset this big country that I'm now pushing into American arms? What if he finally comes to his senses and says, no, let me sort this out with India. I can push them to that fence and they'll be fence-sitters. That's because even if you resolve this boundary dispute tomorrow, there's a whole range of other bilateral, regional, and global differences that India has with China. These include, just like China has river water sharing disputes with a number of Southeast Asian countries, with the Mekong. This is also true in the case of the Brahmaputra River. So there's concern in India that China is the upper riparian. What is it doing? Is there going to be diversion? Are they going to use this in the case of a crisis, etc.? Another major issue is over Tibet. China has always been suspicious of the presence of the Dalai Lama. First, the escape, which Mao Zedong was convinced was a US-India plot and was part of collusion. That the continued presence of the Dalai Lama, his activities, but also several thousands of Tibetan refugees in India is still considered by China a threat to its own security and sovereignty. Economic ties, which were supposed to be kind of the panacea present a panacea for the two countries, well, those end up being, instead of being a glue in the relationship and alleviating, they become another source of friction. Because India, and again, this will sound familiar, some of the concerns we've had, is that India sees the economic relationship, whether it was in terms of trade, investment, tourism, as an asymmetric relationship. It sees at one point, India's trade with China was $100 billion. Out of that, the trade deficit was about $70 billion for India. So India's trade with China is obviously a lot less than ours is, but nonetheless, that deficit amount started creating problems in India. You also see beyond these bilateral differences a series of regional differences that India and China have. India is deeply suspicious of the China-Pakistan relationship that goes back to the 1960s, and India sees China as having strengthened Pakistan's conventional missile and nuclear capabilities. And now, beyond those relationships deepening or those domains deepening between China and Pakistan, you also see an economic element, because the China-Pakistan economic corridor is one of the flagships of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it incidentally goes through some territory that is disputed between India and Pakistan. But you also see over the last 10, 15, 20 years, India also growing extremely concerned about China's growing economic footprint in every one of its other neighbors except Bhutan. In Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives. And India is concerned to some extent about what this is going to, the fiscal impact, what it's going to do to these countries' debt burdens. But it's also concerned about the strategic and political implications, the influence that China is getting through these economic ties. And it sees China actually exercising influence on these countries' choices, or at least trying to shape them, both to India's detriment, but also to the US's. So for instance, there was a visiting forces agreement that the US and Sri Lanka were negotiating. The Chinese intervened to get the Sri Lankans to nix that at one point. It subsequently happened, but nonetheless, you've seen this problem. Even with some US-Nepal economic ties, there was going to be an agreement. The Chinese tried to scuttle it, and then India stepped in to help ensure that that would happen. But even more broadly in the region, beyond kind of South Asia, if you look at the Indo-Pacific and Asia more broadly, what you see is in an India that says it has a very different vision of the region and America's role in it than China does. India believes China wants a unipolar Asia where Beijing sets the terms. India says it wants a multipolar Asia. India wants more US in the Indo-Pacific. It sees and talks about the US as a resident power in Asia. China sees the US as an external power, and till just last week was saying there should be an Asia for Asians mentality in the area. Also across the region, India is not just thinking about unilateral changes of status quo at the border, at its own border, it also thinks that China is not respecting the rules-based order in other parts of the region, whether that's in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, or the East China Sea. And beyond all that, there's a global set of differences. All the areas where I mentioned India and China used to cooperate in the multilateral space, trade, cyber governance, climate change, they're not cooperating anymore. They are actually competing on these issues. Moreover, India also fundamentally thinks that on the global stage, China is actually out to hinder India's rise and its membership and interests in various institutions. Underlying all this are two other things. Just a fundamental lack of trust now in India about China sticking to its commitments, which makes actually even resolving the current standoff a little bit difficult. But the other thing that underlies all these concerns is the capabilities gap. So even as India's concerns about China have grown, the capabilities gap between the two countries has grown considerably. 30 years ago, China and India had economies the same size. Today, China's economy is more than 5 times that of India. Its defense budget is more than 3.5 times that of India. And so what you have today is an India that not only has a bigger challenge, but it also has this capabilities gap. And so it cannot see. You have a rival that is much bigger than you and has become, if you're India, more threatening. So you're not going to look at US-China competition like you did US-Soviet competition, because this country is its main rival. So India's choices are not what they were during the Cold War. Non-alignment is not feasible when it comes to China. An alliance, from India's perspective, is not desirable, but frankly, we're not even offering one. Can you imagine getting a security treaty through Congress? Currently, no. Also one that takes responsibility for the entire India-China border. So what is the answer that India has looked to, since its alliance and non-alignment aren't possible? It's something that actually India has done before, both times, once with the Soviet Union, once with the US. Both times it's taken this approach to balance China. And that option is alignment. Alignment doesn't mean that India and the US agree on everything, but it's an interest-based alignment where Indians recognize that they are unlikely to make the concessions that China would demand for India to take a truly non-aligned posture. But it also recognizes that India can't go it alone. That because of that capabilities gap I mentioned, India needs partners to help it develop its own capabilities, but also to manage this rise. Who are these partners? So some of them are traditional, some of them are newer. There are a range of them in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia. Now you're seeing South Korea, a number of Southeast Asian countries. India's particularly been close to Vietnam, to Singapore in the past, but now developing a close relationship with the Philippines as well. Some European partners, some of whom happen to have interests in the Indo-Pacific, including Britain and France, but also India is seeing Germany and the EU more broadly as, especially on the economic and technology side, partners in terms of the economic and technology competition it has with China. In Europe, also another partner that India has traditionally seen as part of its balancing strategy is Russia, which is one of the reasons it continues to maintain a relationship with Russia. But there's a complication there. Russia is now best friends with China. This is a problem for India. So India now is essentially playing defense there, trying to ensure that Russia doesn't go from being neutral between India and China to taking China's side, which would have deep implications for India's military readiness. So who does that leave? The country that India is doubling down particularly on is the partnership with the US, because India sees the US as more like-minded than any one of the countries that I have named when it comes to China, but also the country that has the greatest ability to do something about the challenge that China poses. And so what you've seen today is an India that sees China as a challenge, a US that sees China as a challenge, and both either can't or don't want to deal with the China challenge on their own. And so you're starting to see this cooperation develop. India sees, when it's looking at China, it sees the US as useful in building India's own capabilities, in helping offer alternatives in the region. India doesn't have the scale to compete, for example, with the Belt and Road Initiative on its own. But India also sees the US as crucial in maintaining a favorable balance of power in the region and deterring China. The US sees India as useful in terms of being a geopolitical counterbalance, an economic alternative, technologically a more trusted partner, and depending on the day, a democratic contrast to China. India is the one country that can actually prove that development, at that scale, development and democracy aren't mutually exclusive. And so, as I said, you've seen that convergence. There's convergence on China, but it's also led to deeper cooperation across a range of issues. Diplomatically, a range of, you see Indian and American officials across working levels, political levels, at the leader level, meeting constantly, coordinating, not just on bilateral issues, but also in regional and international institutions in a way you didn't before. You've also seen economic ties grow between the two countries, not just generally, which is also happening, trade and investment has grown, but also as part of each other's diversification from China's strategies. So I'll give you two examples. As the US is seeking to diversify, build more resilient supply chains, you're seeing the US Development Financing Corporation actually invest in two large projects, one by an Indian company, one by an American company. It's their two largest financing in projects in the world, and both are to produce solar panels. And so the idea is that this will mean diversification, giving not just India, because it's not just for the domestic Indian market, but in terms of broader supply chains, some diversification. A second example I'll give you is Apple in India. Apple has put in place a China Plus One strategy where they're actually starting to move some production through its Taiwanese subcontractors into India. And you have these new factories coming out, and they even have these Taiwanese subcontractors like Foxconn taking the Chinese engineers from their factories in China to go and supervise and eventually retrain the people who will take their jobs in India. And so, Apple's not going to move its entire supply chain, but you're starting to see diversification happen. You're also seeing between the US and India deep defense and security cooperation that was unheard of, mostly because India was very reluctant to cooperate with the US because in part it thought it would provoke China. You're seeing this across different military exercises. You're seeing India in 2007, India bought no military equipment from the US. Today, India has bought almost $30 billion worth of military equipment. Some of that has been deployed at the border as well, including in terms of C-130s and C-17s, helping actually insert troops and equipment near the border areas, to Chinooks and Apache helicopters, to the most recent deals. India has one of the largest fleet of P-8 maritime reconnaissance aircraft, which it is also interoperable with not just the US, but also a number of US allies that have similar platforms. And so what you've seen is acquisitions. The most recent one was armed drones from the US. But India is also now co-producing and co-developing. So I don't know if you have some of them based here in Colorado, the C-130s, the big strategic airlift planes. Every one of their tails of those planes, globally produced, every one of those tails is now produced in a factory in Hyderabad in southern India. And so you're seeing now going to co-production. The most recent thing on that side, very sensitive technology, jet engine technology. India and the US, GE just signed a deal with an Indian company to co-produce engines for India's light combat aircraft. So you're seeing a level of defense and security cooperation and interoperability. India and the US just finished up an exercise off the eastern coast of India where all the services were participating from both countries. you're seeing technologically a lot of cooperation, both in the commercial and the defense cyber side, space side. India has just joined the Artemis program. The US will be helping send the first Indian astronaut into space for a few decades. And you've seen, for example, the US Space Force signing research contracts. The first ones they've done with a non-American company is with 2 Indian startups. So you're seeing this kind of very granular cooperation that's driven by this like-mindedness on China. You're seeing it, you've got somebody coming and talking about critical minerals. India and the US are talking about, India's joined the US Mineral Security Partnership about diversifying supply chains even in this space. And then you're seeing this even spill out in terms of cooperation in the people-to-people side, where you're seeing the US actually actively recruit students in terms of talent and skilling on the technology side. There are now, India will soon be the largest source of students overtaking China for the US. 75% of the Indian students in the US are in STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths fields. And so you've seen a relationship that has been transformed, particularly, and the reason I often mention defense and security is it used to be very sensitive for India to do. And so that particularly is something all of us look at as a real kind of signal of change. I'm just going to take kind of 5 more minutes to just also talk about a couple of other things that have happened that China has essentially pushed India out of its comfort zone in doing. There were certain things that India didn't. India used to have this Monroe Doctrine about the South Asia and the Indian Ocean. It didn't want to see external powers involved. Today, India wants to see a greater US power and presence in the Indian Ocean. So you've seen China push India to change its mind about the region. Because they're seeing more PLA Navy coming into the Indian Ocean. They need a bigger power and presence of not just the US, but other partners, like France, like Britain, like Australia. This is one reason why India is actually quite supportive of something like AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK deal, which obviously not just China, but some other countries in the region have not been very pleased about. The other thing that India doesn't, has had partnerships, but it's tended to not work in coalitions that aren't UN-led. You're seeing a real phase of US-India coalition building. India willing to work with the US within interest or issue-based coalitions. The most prominent one being the quadrilateral Quad, with Australia, India, Japan, and the US. And I can talk about more what it does, but they have 2 lines of effort. A whole bunch of activities around maritime security and others to essentially help shape that favorable balance of power in the region. The second is to help build resilience in the region. Not just kind of helping regional countries better able to combat things like illegal fishing. Nobody ever mentions China in the Quad, but it is driven in part by concerns about China. But also in terms of building health and climate resilience in the region, which is what the region often wants. They don't want to talk about US-China or India-China competition. So you see this Quad really now, including with the Maritime Security Dialogue, the 4 countries have an annual military exercise. They work quite closely together. But now you're even seeing India join coalition. There's something called I2U2, an US, India, Israel, UAE coalition. You see India working with the US on connectivity projects, in part to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. There's an India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that is being developed that in the Middle East involves countries like the Saudis, Israelis, and the UAE. So you're really seeing kind of this cooperation in India's extended neighborhood taking place, which is different with the US. US and India usually clashed on the Middle East. They now coordinate in the Middle East. And you're seeing the US, in turn, while India is pushing itself outside its comfort zone, the US is also starting to think about India now as an actor in Southeast Asia and the Middle East in a way that it wasn't earlier. And overlying this is kind of the shadow of China. I'll end with just a few limits or differences to this kind of cooperation and convergence, or convergence and cooperation that I talked about. There are some differences on China itself. One is threat prioritization. For India, its major concern, its major contingency that it's thinking about is going to be the China-India border. It also thinks about, a growing Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean, but it always will primarily think about the China-India border. For us, it's a contingency in the Taiwan Strait. It's a contingency potentially in the South China Sea. Now, the US did help India when there was the border crisis in 2020 through fast tracking of military equipment, intelligence sharing, diplomatic support. But India will fight its own war there. That threat prioritization, therefore, is different. And it means, there are these questions about what will India do? What can we expect of India in a Taiwan crisis? I can talk about that in Q&A, but I don't want to do it right now. The second difference is, as India thinks about who its partners are, it thinks about continues to think about Russia as an important part of its balancing strategy vis-a-vis China. Because it thinks Russia and China have differences that will eventually re-emerge. So India thinks about Russia as part of the solution to its China problem. We think about Russia as part of the problem to the China problem because of Russia-China relations. So that's a difference. Another kind of limit or kind of a problem that might arise from both India and the US's China strategies is, as these kind of restrictions are being put in place on economic and technology side to restrict, mostly to target China, they sometimes inadvertently hit your like-minded friends as well. So we're seeing this, for example, with some of these deals that, or tariffs, for example, there were tariffs directed against China. Those also ended up affecting India as well. The other concern, I think, the limit on the differences on China is, or maybe doubts. There's this constant doubts in both countries. Will the other stay committed to the region? Will the other actually deliver and be an actor or play the kind of role that both would like to see? India will not hedge because of these doubts, India will not hedge between the US and China, but it will hedge, and it will hedge over uncertainty about the US. Who knows what happens to China policy or Indo-Pacific commitment after November, right? And so it will hedge against uncertainty about the US. It will also, because India does not like to be over-dependent on any one country, it will hedge on over-dependence on the US. There's also, and this is really the final point I make, there are a broader set of differences between India and the US that are emerging, and we don't know the answer in terms of how they will affect the relationship. But I put it as, it comes down to the level of openness that both India and the US will display. One is in terms of how politically open will India and the US continue to be. How strong will India and the US be as democracies? Because it's connected to how cohesive the two countries will be internally. And that, at the end of the day, is not just a values question. It will affect both countries' ability to play an effective global and regional role. Economically, how open are both countries going to be? Are we going to continue to be, are protectionist instincts going to actually be at the forefront, or are we actually going to back to, at any point, add to a level of openness? Is India going to create a better business environment so that it's not just an Apple or a Tesla, but many more American companies try to diversify that go there? How open will the US be about immigration? And then finally, strategically, how open will the two countries be in terms of strategic culture? You have a US that is used to dealing with allies. We know what that looks like. Our systems are set up to that. Here's this strange kind of partner plus that is aligned but not an ally. On the flip side, India is not used to having such a close partnership. Even as close as India was to the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, the Soviets never got base access in India, which the US today has. Soviets and Indians barely exercised together as militaries. That's not the case with you. So can an India that doesn't do alliances and a US that loves alliances, can they have a strategically open mind to be able to work with each other? And I'll stop there.
If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll start here in front.
I didn't hear a lot about the relationship with Russia as far as energy.
Do you want me to?
Yes, go ahead and address it.
Great question. So what's very interesting about and it's mostly an oil question because India doesn't really import LNG or natural gas from Russia and a little amount of coal, but not really. Before there wasn't much of an energy relationship between Russia and India. India had some investments in Russian oil fields. They were fairly minimal, nothing like, in fact, even Western companies like Exxon and others had. Before, India imports almost all the oil it consumes. And there's some domestic, but about 90% of the oil it consumes. And it's one of the fastest growing oil consumers in the world. So it needs a lot of oil. Its traditional partners have been, or sources have been in the Middle East, Africa. It had started importing from Latin America as well. Before February 2022, India's imports from Russia were only 2% of its total imports, oil imports. It's now about 25 to 30%. Now, the Ukrainian foreign minister at one point, and he was just in India last week, and now he's changed his mind, and I'll tell you why, but he at one point said India has blood on its hands. The problem is this oil is a very complex picture. For one, it is not actually sanctioned. Why are India, anything that's sanctioned from Russia, India actually complies with US and EU sanctions because it's closer to the West. Its banks have no interest in any kind of Indian bank. Its central bank has no interest in any Indian bank violating sanctions and running afoul of the Western system. Why haven't we sanctioned oil? The Europeans actually wanted to, because one thing both the administration, Congress, and American oil companies realized is if you sanction Russian oil, you're taking a lot of oil off the global market. What's that going to do to prices? And what's that going to do to prices is not just an economic issue, as all of you know, it's a political issue. So, not sanctioned, there was a price gap which India largely complies with. That was the solution, that you're going to limit Russia's revenues. So it's not actually sanctioned, they won't. But guess what's happening with all this oil, or a lot of this oil that India is importing? Guess where it's going after it's refined in India? Europe. So Europe says we're not importing oil anymore from Russia, pat on our backs. We've told them they're importing it via India. And the other complication has been, which India will often say, they're a developing country. When they think about energy security, affordability is part of that. And they have taken a stance that, look, we have a lot of, we're not people who can find a more expensive source. We are going to find oil where it's affordable, and we will import it. And you see this, they're very price sensitive. So you see a month-to-month change, where the months where Russia stops giving them a certain discount, or India can find cheaper oil elsewhere, Russian imports from Russia drop. The complication has been is why have India's other sources prices gone up? Is because now the Europeans who say we're not going to buy from Russia, they're buying from India's traditional suppliers in the Middle East. Other complication, because of sanctions, two countries that used to be sources of oil for sources of imports for India are actually sanctioned in terms of oil exports, Iran and Venezuela. And India does not import from, and I think Venezuela is lifted, they're going to go back in place. So it's a complex issue. And, India, in fact, you don't hear the Biden administration criticizing India on this anymore because they recognize its complexity. And now you even don't see Europeans because they recognize that they're importing this refined product. So there is a question. They are asking themselves, should we really be doing this? And honestly, if they stop buying, you'll see India stop because they want, what are they going to do with all this refined product? They need markets. And so if Europe stops buying, India will stop importing from Russia.
Yes, in fact.
Yes, thank you very much. The case you make on the improvement in relations between India and the U.S. is very powerful and positive. However, India is a co-signer of BRICS, which is one of the gravest threats that faces the U.S. dollar as the global currency. How do you justify India's improvement with the U.S. with this, by India joining our competitors in a very grave and serious threat?
So what's interesting about BRICS, and when it first started out, this was this Brazil, Russia, India, China grouping. It was kind of emerging markets. What's really ironic about it, because it started out as a non-West grouping, it was actually a Goldman Sachs idea. So it was kind of an imported Western idea. Why does India join this in the first place? And why did it join in the kind of, there was this phase in the 2000s where India felt that it was growing, Its economy was doing really well. It was actually growing at about 8-9%, even 10% in 2009. But it was not getting a voice in any platforms, that they were dominated by the West. So India saw Russia, India, China trilateral, BRICS, and eventually South Africa joined this grouping as a non-West platform. For them, it wasn't about being anti-West. It was saying, look, we have certain, we're all emerging markets, we're developing, and it was largely economic, as you alluded to with the dollar, the comment on the dollar. And so you saw kind of India join this BRICS. There was a formation of this new development bank. What ended up happening, though, is from India's perspective, its competition with China spills over into BRICS too. India starts seeing not just China trying to dominate BRICS, but Russia, which used to partner with India, suddenly aligning with China in BRICS. So for India, they also start to see the Chinese and Russians try to take this from being a non-West platform to an anti-West platform. India has zero interest in that. As I said, most of their partners today, not just for their security, but for the economic and technological transformation they want to become a great power, is with the West. And so they look at BRICS, and you start seeing this in terms of who's attending BRICS summits. People go, nothing actually happens. An Indian, you would have Indian drafters essentially spend time taking out references to kind of anti-US, anti-Israel language, and also ensuring that the BRICS statements weren't endorsing China's Belt and Road Initiative. Those are the kind of things you'd see. It's become, India actually wasn't all that keen on BRICS expansion, because now there's a whole bunch of new BRICS countries. China was driving it, because India felt that that would dilute India's voice, but also many of the countries that joined had closer ties with China than they did, with China would have more sway with them than with India. So India won't leave BRICS, but we should be very glad they're in there, because they will make sure they won't get very much done, including a BRICS currency. Because guess what that currency is probably going to be linked to? The renminbi. India has zero interest in helping internationalize the renminbi. The Indian foreign minister has said there will be no BRICS currency. You will see, as I think, this is something China and Russia are doing. India's doing it as it's settling some of its trade in rupees. But it's still, its central bank holds a hell of a lot of dollars. It's not going to be de-dollarizing anytime soon. They want to be able to use rupees. They have a fabulous, even better than most Western countries, digital payment infrastructure in place. We'll probably adopt that at some point, or at least parts of it. Many countries in the developing world will. But I don't see BRICS being a threat. My attitude to BRICS is don't ignore it. It reflects a real, and why did so many countries apply to join BRICS? It reflects, particularly after the effect of sanctions on food, fuel, fertilizer security, also COVID and the unequal distribution of vaccines and things like that, a real frustration in many countries about not having a voice. So we shouldn't ignore it, but I wouldn't overestimate it as well. And I think its own internal contradictions and competitions will eventually ensure that it won't be the kind of threat that one might have expected about a decade or so ago.
Yes.
How can we continue to improve relations with India, considering Modi's treatment of Muslims domestically?
So to me, this whole question about democracies and values, it's very interesting. You'd think democracy would have been a big driver, human rights in the relationship. It really hasn't been. It's been a factor. I call it a force multiplier across a range of issues. But if you look at it, India and the US had an estranged relationship at the point India had a thriving democracy, and guess who the US was partnering with in South Asia? A military dictatorship in Pakistan, right? Even President Carter, human rights president, in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, goes from sanctioning Pakistan to helping start the partnership with General Zia-ul Haq. So I think part of it is we have to be conscious of our own history. We've often, we don't judge our closest partners necessarily, or some allies, yes, but it's not. When we have strategic imperatives beyond a point, we do not we do not let those values imperatives that we care about. Having said that, I think democracy and human rights and an understanding of being free societies are the special sauce in the US-India relationship. They, as I said, are a force multiplier. So why is it that an Apple or Tesla or other companies that are trying to have China plus one strategies are looking at India? It's not just because of its scale. It's not because, frankly, Vietnam is a more effective, has more effective manufacturing facilities. But especially on the technology side, why is India a trusted partner? Because we think it's an open society that we think is not going to become China. Right? Also, we are diverse societies. India and the US are perhaps the most diverse societies in the world. If we cannot manage our diversity well through respecting minorities, through having democratic systems that work for everybody, to having kind of a view of the world where everybody is actually equal, that's not just a values issue. That becomes a strategic issue because we don't manage diversity effectively. It means internally we will be less cohesive. It becomes a strategic issue because if you are spending time and resources on security at home, and I mean this for both the US and India, as polities, if we are not effective at home, we cannot be effective abroad. And so to me, I think both the US and India have to do a lot better at ensuring all the kind of value stock we talk about. India calls itself the mother of democracy. We're still kind of the shining city on a hill. We actually have to live up to that. But on the fundamental, the driver is a relationship. Sadly, it has not been democracy. It's usually been when the US and India have been strategically important to each other, that's what's driven the relationship.
Yeah. How did the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban affect India's security, its relationship with Pakistan and China, and just its cultural relationship, its historic relationship with Afghanistan?
So India, in fact, after the Karzai and the Ghani government was in place, India had a very close relationship. India doesn't usually believe in isolating countries or sanctioning countries, but there are two governments it has not recognized and isolated in the past. One was the apartheid government in South Africa, and the second was the Taliban government in the 1990s. So India had very fraught relationship with the Taliban government regime. It saw it as essentially very close partner Pakistan and helping shelter groups, extremist and terrorist groups that were targeting India. And so before 2001, you saw a very fraught India-Afghan relationship. But as you said, there are historic and cultural ties there that re-emerged. And you saw particularly India contribute. The US partly asked India not to send troops because it would affect to any coalition, because the Pakistanis wouldn't like it in Afghanistan. But India did a lot in terms of billions of dollars of assistance, helped set up a huge, the electrification in a part of Afghanistan. They in fact call electricity, the term they use is kind of Indian power. They built roads and railways. But they also did, the other thing, even the Taliban is now enjoying. They built things like cricket stadiums. The Afghan parliament helped train the Afghan cricket team. Actually, it still does most of their training in India. So you really saw this relationship reemerge. Having said that, you saw India even investing in mines for critical minerals, as did China. But all this was on the basis of an underlying security situation that the US and the international force helped guarantee. India was not happy about the way the withdrawal happened. It knew it was coming, though, because from 2014, when President Obama was talking about it, including in his campaigns, they knew this was eventually going to happen. I think like many countries, like many of us here, didn't like the way it played out. But the way the Indian foreign minister has put it is, the US spent 18 years there. And that's a lot of investment in a place. And that at the end of the day, the world couldn't expect the US to do that indefinitely. So they weren't happy about it. The US helped India, evacuate a number of its citizens who were going to be targeted by the Taliban that was going to take over. And you saw, I think, for the Indian public, one of the things it reinforces, look, the US always leaves. They left in Vietnam, they left in... So you did see in the Indian public concern about the withdrawal, some criticism. Like in many places, talk of decline of the US. What does this say about the US? Having said that, the Indian government didn't buy into that talk. We were talking earlier about decline, that the US is declining. In fact, there were some in India that said, actually, because the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan, it would be able to now spend more time and attention on the Indo-Pacific, which is what India wants to. There were also some who said, look, actually, the fact that the US is not in Afghanistan anymore suddenly makes Pakistan less important to the US. So you do still see a Pakistan-US relationship on things like ensuring the safety and security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, which we care about. There is concern, there's still some counterterrorism cooperation to do with Afghanistan. Having said that, that has been true, that Pakistan is now not a priority country in that sense. And so in some ways, the fact that the Taliban has taken over strategically for India is not great. But they've also seen what they worried about with the Taliban government in power is that they would essentially be an ally of the Pakistanis. Guess what's happening? The Taliban and the Pakistanis are fighting these days. So even that has inadvertently, today Pakistan is complaining about the Taliban sponsoring terrorism. And so, you see people in India sitting and saying, wait, you guys, when we told you it's our right to kind of deal with terrorist groups that you're supporting, you're now saying the same thing. They're flying sorties into Afghanistan. So Taliban-Pakistan relations have become quite fraught. So I think India still would have preferred a non-Taliban government in Afghanistan, and it did hit their strategic interests. But all in all, I think even they recognized that it was not going to be forever. The US is not going to be forever there. They absolutely are concerned about China's ties with the Taliban. India has not and will not recognize the Taliban or be the first country to recognize the Taliban. Having said that, they are having back-channel discussions. Partly, they want to ensure that the only country they don't want China to be the only country that the Taliban is actually talking to. But they're cautious about the Taliban as a group. The Taliban, for instance, took an entire Indian plane hostage at one point, or people close to them. And so, or terrorist groups that then flew the aircraft to Kandahar at the time. So India is quite concerned about the situation, but I think they probably feel it's in a better place than it would have been when the withdrawal actually happened.
Other questions? Yes. What do you think of Modi?
What do I think of Modi? That's a whole book to be written. He is the most, and I say this as a historian, you have since India became independent, a few prime ministers that are really big personality, almost presidential-like figures that help transform the country for good and bad. Prime Minister Nehru was one. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And I think Prime Minister Modi is now going to be in that bracket. He has a very different idea of India than Nehru did, including about, the kind of where do the kind of majority Hindus fit within society? Some things, for example, there's something that doesn't exist in India, which is called the Uniform Civil Code. It's because in certain, not just religions, but they're kind of what are called scheduled tribes, they practice their own, they have their own civil law and procedure. Modi says, no, there should be one. Now, on the face of it, that sounds great, but there are differences now on, well, if you're going to do this Uniform Civil Code, whose kind of principles is it going to be based on? So he has a fundamentally different view, especially on some, I think, societal, cultural issues. But on other things, he's actually been quite consistent. Foreign policy is actually one. He's much more forward-leaning. He's the first Indian prime minister that is really kind of in a post-Cold War domain thinking, he has not been reluctant. The US has sanctioned Modi, but he comes in and says, I want to make India great again, and who is going to help me do that? It is going to include a country like the US. And he'd actually traveled here a fair bit as a non-politician and really liked the US. But for him, he doesn't have there was not just a West skeptical part of the establishment, but even anti-West, anti-American. He doesn't share that. So he's taken Indian foreign policy. They're consistent in terms of following a diversification strategy, maintaining multiple partnerships, not getting over-dependent. But he's also not, he doesn't see diversification as meaning you have to keep ties with Western countries below a certain threshold because that'll threaten India. He's willing to make use of Western countries and be part of that larger whole. He is bolder. He's a prime minister who becomes the first Indian prime minister to go to Israel, a country that has helped India in every one of its wars, even before India normalized ties with Israel in '92. But no Indian prime minister had visited. But Modi doesn't just, there are people saying, well, he doesn't like Muslims, he's not going to, no. He's actually also, he was the first Indian prime minister to go to Ramallah. He calls Palestine the state of Palestine. He talks about a thriving state of Palestine. He has deepened ties with the Gulf Arab countries. So what he is doing, but again, it is always diversified. So even in the Middle East, relations with the Gulf Arabs, relations with Israel, relations with Iran. So the way I see him is he will be a historic figure. How will we see that history? What will he do if he gets a third term, which is what he seems to be on track? We will be surprised if he doesn't, if not shocked. What will he do with that third term? Will he make constitutional amendments when it comes to religious freedoms? Will he reform economically more in ways that we would actually like? Will he, reach out to, or even not reach out, will he try to stabilize relations with Pakistan? Right now, there's a government in Pakistan that says they want to talk to India. We'll see if that actually lasts, but nonetheless. So, what will the nature of the historicity of, he will be historic. The question is, in what ways? And I think that is left to be written. I will say he remains popular in India. He polls about 25% above his own party. So in the last election, they got, because it's a parliamentary system, they got about less than, about in the 30% range, 30 to 40% range of the vote share. A third of voters said if Modi hadn't been on top of the ticket, they would have voted for somebody else. He's somebody who's popular, but at the same time has not been able to make inroads in India's south, in India's east. Because we often talk about religion in India, Hindu, Muslim. The diversity spans ethnicity, language, caste, tribes. And so, he's popular, but it's not, people talk about him as a Hindu nationalist. He would also call himself an Indian nationalist. Again, as I said, which side we will talk about, is he an Indian nationalist or a Hindu nationalist, we'll see. I don't think that's been written yet. But he will be historic as a figure because he's already helped in good and bad ways, I think, or depending on who you ask. He's already helped transform India's polity and society.
Thank you. We are at 8:30. Thank you.